Hello, welcome to the Men Are Human weekly Friday voice chat. We are the semi-official server of the men's rights subreddit. Today's topic is the war on masculinity and the war on men. And you might be thinking, what the heck am I talking about? Well, a lot of young men and old men and boys and males in general feel increasing hostility from today's political climate and today's social climate. And indeed, MRAs would hold the position that misandry, which is like misogyny, only directed at men, sexism against men, is higher than ever. And I would agree with that. We're going to share a lot of stories and articles today about how society views maleness in a negative way. And if you know my chat with Sam Cedar, I brought up a study where subjects in an experiment were more willing to induce pain on male strangers for money than female strangers for money. And I'm going to post a link in a second called the Women Are Wonderful Effect, which was a psychological study that showed that overall, both men and women, in general, disfavor men when making personal judgments, whether it's a politician, whether it's showing leniency in prison sentencing, whether it's helping a homeless person on the streets. Society is more willing to help women than to help men. And Karen Strawn did an excellent video, I'm going to link that too, on male disposability. The concept that men are seen as sort of disposable. I'm going to kind of twist around a famous quote here. You might recognize it. When a woman dies, it's a tragedy. When a man dies, it's a statistic. And I think that is partially true, because when wars happened historically, thousands and thousands of young men were sent to death, and it was just seen as the norm. But when does a war become tragic? When civilians start dying, when cities start getting bombed. That's when a war becomes tragic. When the civilians start dying. When the 18-year-old boys are dying, it's just, oh yeah, that's war. It's just like that. That's just what happens. So this is something that we are starting to see even in the school system. Even children, even teenage boys are getting lessons in quote-unquote toxic masculinity. What is toxic masculinity if not the idea that masculinity is a bad thing? And I know feminists dress it up by saying, oh, no, it's just a certain innate social conditions of, yeah, basically it means men are bad, which it is. That's essentially what, no matter how you dress up the definition of toxic masculinity, that is exactly what you are saying. You're saying that masculinity is a bad thing. It is absolutely not, oh, it's how men can't express themselves. That's never been true. That has never been true in history, that men don't express themselves, okay? Because there are stories of ancient Roman times. It was mostly men doing theaters. It was mostly men who were poets. It was mostly men who were philosophers. So the whole idea that men have never been able to express their emotions or feelings is ridiculous. What is true, though, is that sometimes men are judged for it. And I think especially now. And I don't think it's because of toxic masculinity. I think it's the other way around. What men are criticized most harshly, more than any other man, for expressing their emotions? Men's rights activists. When men talk about men's issues, that is when they are told to shut up the most. That is when they are shamed for expressing their emotions the most. The time when a man is most shamed more than any other time for expressing his emotions is a feminist shaming a men's rights activist for talking about his experiences. So I call absolute BS when feminists say that toxic masculinity is when a man can't express himself, because MRAs literally are men expressing themselves and we're shamed for it. So I'm going to kind of sit back on this one. I'm going to share those links, and guys, speak up. You know, if you have an article you like, a study you like, a story from your school or your workplace or your family or whatever, this is a great time to share. So I'm going to post those links, and guys, the floor is yours.
I thought it might be a good thing to start with is this list I found of top 10 toxic masculine behaviors. If we go through it, it's quite an interesting study in bullshit, basically. Top one, being stoic. Men are constantly given the message that they must be self-reliant, independent, physically tough, and so on. Now, I can see that there is an argument to be made that being too stoic is a bad thing. The next thing on the list is being promiscuous. Typically, men will be praised by other men for sexual conquests. And that's something that feminists are now saying, that women should be more promiscuous. Women should be hyper promiscuous. They should sleep with all the men, and so it's quite interesting that if you go down the rest of these, you notice that a lot of them are things that feminists aspire to. Being stoic, for example, feminists now aspire to be the action hero. They aspire to be the basically to replace the man who breaks down the door and shoots all the bad guys. And she doesn't need no man. She doesn't need rescuing. It's very, very much like they are aspiring to toxic masculinity here. The next one is being heterosexual. That's a very strange one. So they want men to be gay.
So it's basically it's shaming someone for their orientation. The same people who stress how orientation is not a choice and it's not something you can control or choose are now shaming orientation.
Yeah, well, they will do that.
But when a man compliments another woman in the street and they automatically assume that he is like being predatory towards her, no, that's just giving you a compliment, and that's just because,
Okay, to that point, let me just really quickly interject. I have found the best pickup line that gets around all of that. Okay, it was a stroke of genius. It was in the gym. I think I mentioned it last week, a little while back. So there was a girl, okay, and she knows how she looks, and she knows that she gets hit on and looked at all the time. So this is what I walked up to her, and in a dead serious voice, I said, of all the girls in this gym, you are definitely one of them. And I turned around and I walked away. Long story short, it worked.
That's kind of amusing, which brings me down to the one of the next ones, which is, well, actually, let's do the three of them: being violent, being dominant, and being sexually aggressive. These are stereotypes of men, and granted, some men are like that, but basically, these are things that used to be applied to black men almost exclusively. They would basically, the racists they would say, oh yeah, black men, they're stupid, they're violent, they want to be dominant, they sexually aggressive, and they don't have real emotions, which is the next one, not displaying emotion. They'd say all these slurs against them, and now they're basically just taking the blackouts and they're sticking men on that, but they're being passive aggressive, and they're framing it as them wanting to help men be less violent, be less dominant. But here's the thing: being violent can also mean being protective. It can mean taking a protective role, like a fireman violently kicking down a door to save a child. Being dominant can be a good thing. It can be, you have to dominate your company to be successful. Some of the best people around are dominant. Some of the best men around are dominant. Sexual aggression towards women. Now, this is a slur. This is basically, equating all men with being the rapists. Men who conform to toxic masculinity standards are more likely to make sexual comments or sexist jokes to women. Men don't really do that. That's not really conforming. Men have always, obviously, you've always had the low tier man who would do that, but he's looked upon very, very harshly by most men. That's not conforming. That's actually breaking the standards. That's going against conformity to do that. And then you get not displaying emotion. Men do display emotion. They just don't display emotion the same way women do. Men are more reserved in their emotions, but they do display emotion. They just don't have the same sort of they will go off into the woods and sit around a campfire, and they will talk about their emotions with other men over a beer, but they won't do it in quite the same way. They won't make eye contact. They'll do it while they're doing other things, and it will often take the form of a story. So they'll talk about their ex, they'll talk about, all that sort of stuff. The emotion it tends to be implied. So this is really a list of like a lot of this stuff on here, not all of it, but a lot of it is pretending women can't be violent, pretending women can't be dominant, pretending they can't be sexually aggressive, and then turning around and mislabeling what men do as bad, when they don't really understand what's going on to begin with, and they are mostly the reason that men aren't allowed to go and do these things. Which brings me to the next one on the list: not being a feminist ally. So you see where this list this list wants you to be a feminist. This is basically what they are after. They're not after they're not trying to help men. They're trying to get them to be servants for women. This is about chivalry. The next one on the list, weirdly feminist wasn't the last one, but is risk taking. Risk taking is very important. There is absolutely nobody who's remembered favorably in history who didn't take some sort of massive risk. Like the people we remember, like the Bravehearts, the Churchills, the Eisenhowers, those people took risks. And the last one is not engaging in household chores and caregiving, because of course men who work full-time jobs, because that is the role that's been forced on them by society, then have to come home and help with the household chores and caregiving, which they do anyway. Men do that. They just don't help with the household chores necessarily that feminists highlight, because they're often doing other ones. Like men are often engaged in fixing the house. I have seen men fixing things that belong to their wives and partners, and they rarely get credit for it. It's just expected, and that is it in a nutshell. They just finish with a whole blurb on toxic masculinity versus femininity, and it's basically, this is the scale they're on. They don't want men to be masculine, they want them to be feminine, because they're afraid of masculinity. And this is what it all boils down to. Feminists are afraid of masculinity, and often non-feminists are afraid of it too, because what the media has filtered our expectation to be is that men are violent perpetrators of crimes and women are their victims. So if you watch films, you'll see the gang of deranged men trying to rape the woman in the alley, and like the superhero films, and the hero man steps in and he's like the one good man who's out to help the women. And
So, about the first point, being stoic, I think what they're trying to say, and they have got links for them. You can check it out. First, second, and third citation has been given there. So, what I think is that when someone tries to hide their emotions or tries to pretend that they are someone else when they actually are not, and when they try to hide something from others, not being honest, I think that's one of the intentions that they are trying to convey. However, I think the wording here is a bit fucked up. So that might be the issue with the first point, being stoic. The second one, being promiscuous. Being promiscuous, I think there should be no such encouragement, I guess is the right term for this. There should be no such encouragement for men seeking out more and more sexual experiences when they are not sure of what will happen to them post that experience. If they are not they should first check with themselves as to whether they really are comfortable with seeking out more sexual opportunities, or do they like to be more reserved. So I think that's the intention, being saying that men are commonly promoted. Or you can see rap songs, for example, they're in the rap songs, they often promote it, to be honest. And this is indeed a correct point. I think so, being promiscuous is promoted for men, especially in certain genres of songs, and in older films. I think that's a correct point. Now, the third point, being heterosexual. I think this also has a good point in it, that men who try to be intimate with other men without having sex with them, this is important, without having sex with them, but they try to be intimate in others, like sharing a bed with them, for example, or maybe kissing them, or any of those things, which normally I think they should be accepted in society. But there are people, more often they are traditionally minded, they try to shame them, they try to shame such men for not conforming to their ideals of what they think heterosexual men should do and should not do. I think that's the point behind saying that this heterosexual form of masculinity is being too restrictive for men themselves, and it is acting to their own detriment. Now, the fourth point, being violent, I think this has a point. Like, men generally are the perpetrators, most are the perpetrators, as well as are the victims. So we MRS try to focus on the victims part. Like, the most of the victims of violent crime indeed are men, and we need to study why, and we need to study this male on male conflict, to be honest with you. I think the way men deal with each other sometimes gets too aggressive, and de-escalation is not followed there. Like, if you study, like if you read a bit into the de-escalation literature, you will find there are three steps. Like, first of all, de-escalation, then escape, and finally self-defense. So when people try to go to the third stage, that is self-defense or attack more directly, being violent, then I guess that can bring more damage to them as well as their opponent in the long term. I think that needs to be discussed. Now, the what is this? This was third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh one, I guess. Not displaying emotion. This one I think is valid. You can see this. You can see the citations for it, and yes, it is true that the more traditional you are, you try to shame other men for being emotional. Or this is important, that anger is the only emotion that is particularly valid for men to display in others. For example, when men try to be sad about something or they cry, they are often mocked. So that's the point. Like, you need to break those barriers. I think that's the point behind it. Risk taking. So men are human. You made a point about that. Most famous people in history are known to be risk takers, but I also think that there is a point to be made about the mental health of people who took these risks, and how they dealt with it. Did did they manage to deal with that stress effectively, or did they cope with some other means that would not be that efficient today? I think that needs to be discussed. Like, this is, it is one aspect to say that, yeah, risk taking helped men to win wars, or for example lead the nation when it was in danger. But at the same time, you need to see what happened to those men who took those risks. Like, were they able to manage it effectively, or did they suffer collateral damage?
Well,
So
risk
these were my
management
initial
is
points.
different. Sorry, risk management is different to
Yeah, go on.
being risk adverse. When they seem to be very risk adverse, I'm going to push back on a lot of what you're saying, because, granted, you're saying that it's homophobic for a man not to share a bed with another man, basically, and not to kiss them. And that's a purely cultural thing. And I don't think it's necessarily anything to do with toxic masculinity so much as homophobia, or possibly men just not being comfortable kissing other men, which is, if you're
Yes,
gay, it's a lot
fair point.
more attractive than if you're not gay. And if you're not gay, then you probably don't want to share a bed with another man, and you probably don't want to kiss them. And likewise, a lot of these things. You did mention that they had citations on that page, but all of those citations are just two feminist papers that don't seem to be particularly good, and they seem to basically just state what feminist talking points, as far as I can see. I'm only clicking through them very quickly, but they don't seem to be of any particular value. Whereas we've got studies showing that culture is driven by men taking risks, men being proactive and independent, and by fatherhood and so on. And I mean, there was an article that was just linked from the, let's see what it was. Yeah, from the New York Times, traditional masculinity can hurt boys. On that's a picture of a traditionally masculine embrace from an older brother to a younger brother. And that's perfectly masculine. Like, there's nothing emasculating about that. And I think they're undermining their point right there in the image. It's, and it's like they're saying that you said that most violence is by men. I don't think so. I think there's a lot of violence by women that just goes completely under the radar because we aren't willing to confront or deal with it. A lot of violence from women gets reclassified as self-defense, and they are very, very frequent users of proxy violence. So a lot of the violence committed by men is often on behalf of women and instigated by them as well. So we can't just like blindly accept what the feminists are saying here, I don't think. I'll see you later, Blue. It's it's very, very dangerous to just classify these stereotypes as something that's real when it's a lot more complex than that. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen women being violent. I've been the victim of female violence. Blue was stabbed in the neck by a woman. It's
I've been a victim of female violence once. I mean, I've had a girl that was like 3 times my size in 5th grade, like wrap her hands around my throat. And that was pretty scary. So, like, and another thing, like I feel like nowadays in society, there are 2 emotions that a man is only allowed to feel: being horny or angry. And then we wonder why we have a bunch of men that are that way.
I think you
So
proved the. Yeah, go on.
I think I don't think that they are that way. I think that they are lonely and hurt.
I mean, you made the
I,
point
I
about men showing only 2 emotions, right? Being horny and
Yeah.
being angry. So
Yeah.
doesn't that prove the point that men are not allowed to show emotions and that might hurt men?
Yes.
I mean, that's the
most
point
men
literally.
are allowed to show emotions. They're just not allowed to show emotional weakness. Like, men are allowed to be happy. They're allowed to have a lot of emotions. They're allowed to be, all sorts of different ones, but they're not allowed to show any kind of victimhood or weakness. And this is something that's reinforced by both traditional values and by feminist values. It's I don't think there's any sector of society that allows men to talk about their feelings, except for male social groups, as I mentioned, which is where men prefer to share their emotions. So, for example, men shed style things where they're making something, or in a like a around a campfire and things like that. But that's where men share their emotions most. And men will share their emotions with friend groups. They'll share their emotions with other men, but they'll typically do it as a story, and they'll typically do it as a gripe rather than crying about it. So men do express their emotions in a different way to women, as I've talked about. I mean, I've had men open up to me quite a lot, even quite masculine men have opened up to me about being hit by their wives, but they'll talk about it as a story, and the emotions, as I've said before, tend to be implied rather than stated. I mean, think what the feminists keep wanting is for men to cry, but that's not very helpful for men. Men do cry, but they prefer to cry on their own. And if they do cry in front of their wife or girlfriend, typically that wife or girlfriend will reject them, as far as I've seen.
I don't.
Nah, I think
As you know,
if I think if your partner derides you for being emotional, then better to be single, I guess.
probably is, but I mean, like I said, men will get out their emotions in computer games. They'll get them out through activities quite a lot of the time. So if a man wants to be alone, is off in his workshop, in his man cave or whatever, doing something, then it's probably the case that he's expressing emotions and using an emotional outlet that helps him. Now, the what the feminists want is they want the man to open up and cry in therapy like a woman does. But that's not necessarily how men really, what's best for men. That's what's best for women that's being projected onto men. And,
I think,
it's,
yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, they really, really don't like masculinity. If you look at articles like this one I'm about to post,
By the way,
see this one
I
here.
wanted to ask a question to you specifically. Do you think there is
Go on.
anything wrong with feminine men or femininity in men in particular?
No, no, I just think that forcing all men to be feminine is a bad idea because not all men are feminine. Uh, Even gay men, a lot of gay men, probably about half of gay men, don't come across as feminine. It's a myth that like most gay men are a bit feminine. A lot of gay men are very masculine. So it's yeah, it's
I Yeah, go on.
yeah. I was just going to talk about this Guardian article. What toxic men can learn from masculine women. What they're saying here is that they want uh, men to be more like masculine women, like tomboys. And that's quite funny because if you actually Google about this, you'll find out that men have similar brains to lesbians, or rather, lesbians have similar brains to straight men. So, really, I don't think they actually know what they want. I think that they are just saying, well, maybe men could be a bit more feminine. Maybe then we'd accept them. But men should be what they want to be. Men should define themselves. They shouldn't be defined by uh, the fears and terrors of insecure, anxious women who are frightened of men and who have possibly had bad experiences in the past with men that they need to deal with and get through. But we shouldn't be defined by what other people think we should be. We should be defined by what we think is valuable.
Yeah, so jumping onto that point, I think men need to be more rebellious to traditional masculinity itself, and I think that the New York Times has made a good point there. The reason for it being that you know if men are to decide what they want to be, you have to see what factors or what culture reinforces them to be like. And the word traditional, quotation marks, the word traditional in itself means that people expect men to act out certain gender roles which they do not expect from women. And that's the point of traditional gender roles for men, specifically speaking. So you have to kind of analyze those traditional gender roles for men and try to see what disadvantages they produce when they are acted out by men themselves. And I think that needs to be discussed among MRAs.
You do need to talk about traditional men and so on. And we also need to not shame men who want to be traditional. We don't need to fall into this feminist trap of thinking that we all have to be this one stereotype of men that we define as a group, and everyone who doesn't fall into that is toxic. That's what the feminists are doing. What we should instead do is embrace all men and try and help men who do have problems and who aren't acting, who are acting against society and so on. We need to help those men, and we need to help men who need help, as who seek help from us as well. I mean, it's worth noting that most men who commit suicide were either seeking help or were already in therapy. And that is an indictment of how little good therapy actually does for men. Like all this talking therapy and stuff, it's not geared for men. This is what the feminists are getting wrong with this. Oh, you should cry. Men should cry. This sort of whole mode of thinking isn't aimed at men. It's aimed at women and projected onto men. But that's not to say men can't cry and get something out of it. That's just talking averages. And if men do find, help in talking therapy as I have, then they should continue with it. But I'm saying that men are probably more helped by the men sheds sort of mode of therapy, where men will make things and talk and make friends, and they will, work through their issues while doing other things with their hands, if that makes sense. I mean, I just don't think that calling men toxic is helpful. I feel that they are basically fighting against something that isn't really particularly real. It's, I mean, I've met men who have toxic personalities, but I wouldn't say they're toxically male. I would say that they're just toxic because I've met women who act the exact same way. And in fact, most of the toxic people I've met act in this same belittling, sardonic, patronizing way, which is fairly consistent both across both men and women.
I think I would. I think that being a traditional culture that many third world countries are. I guess men need to self introspect and look really deep into what they are getting out of it. I don't think men are getting out of traditional. I don't think men are getting much out of it, to be honest with you. And yeah, that's just my viewpoint on it. No. I mean,
I mean,
you look at the
at the
article
end of
just
the
look at the article just posted here. It says a masculinity crisis. China says the boys are not all right. So this is a perfect example of people who try to promote traditional masculinity onto all men. They think that in that way men would be more healthy. Is not actually what's gonna happen. In fact, men would be more stressed out by it. And maybe this is just me speculating. They would have more mental health problems there.
I think the end, I think that the end of the day, it's up to the men or boys to choose what they deem to be healthy or what they are more comfortable with. I would agree that in many cultures there are some toxic norms related to masculinity. I would not say that. I would rather say that not toxic, but some norms that might be a bit toxic or might be harmful to like some men or boys, as like no one is comfortable with uh, social norms, all the social norms, and not everyone is comfortable with social norms. But I would say like it's about choice. Let them have a choice. Let them look into it themselves. Let them learn from the experience. Let them have different perspective. Just not let just not shame anyone for their who they are. And at the end
Yeah,
of the day, I think it's about choice. It's more about choice than anything else. And I would also like to add on that I've seen like feminists talk about how like boys should behave or what's wrong with boys or what's wrong with men and what to do about them. Personally, like it kind of pisses me off at the most because I don't think they have like any idea of what men need, of men how men are, or what boys need, or how boys are, and what do boys faces, how they actually should uh, try to be more positive and less toxic. I don't think feminists have like any idea on that sort of things because at the end of the day, the main framework of the feminist is not about helping men and boys. And when they do talk about helping men and boys, it's not really focused on men, helping men and boys. If you know, if you get what I mean here, I would say like it's like equivalent of how men say that women should behave. It's exactly the same.
Men are so confused right now what they should be, and I think this kind of connects with the lack of self introspection in general among men, to be honest. And this confusion can only be resolved when they are more honest with themselves as to what they have to do, and resist the social norms that are being enforced on them, whether that is from feminists or whether that is from traditional minded people. So that I wanted to add in just.
Yeah, I think the problem is that it always comes back to men have to do something. Men have to do something. Like with your family, man has to do something. With society, men have to do something. It's this endless everybody looking to the men. That's, I think, the real problem here, and that is the root of this traditionalism, not traditional masculinity, but traditional culture, which focuses on men being the rock of the family, who must, take care of the whole family and shoulder the
Yeah,
entire burden himself,
yeah,
and that is expected by
yeah,
all of the women and all of the men all
yeah.
together, and it's expected by the
Mm.
government, it's expected by, yeah, it is just the expectation. And to say to men, oh, you can push to get out of this by crying, I think that's dangerous, because it is ignoring the fact that women have to step up to help men in order to do that, and they have to help men in a way that isn't patronizing, nasty, or undermines their sense of self and well being. Because what the feminists do is they attack men's sense of self, say they should be like women, say women should be like men, and everything just gets muddled up. Instead, we should be saying, okay, we're all people, let's support all each other, and let's, you know, not try to define ourselves so hard by gender norms, and instead embrace the idea that we are individual people who can go out and do things, and then not say use that as an excuse to attack people using stereotypes. I think that's the method of going forward. And uh, is anyone else got any sort of opinions on this? Because me, uh, local feminist, and Zeta have basically dominated the chat. So if Mad, Kilo, or Dark, or what about Taz have anything to say, that would be probably a
Also,
What
good.
about
also I
Kaz? What's your opinion?
Oh,
Also, last point I would like to add, but
oh,
I think the point you said that everyone expects men to be the initiator. I think, and this is a controversial point I'm raising here. I think that men's issues must be raised and solved by men themselves primarily. There's no escaping around this. Honest, if you ask me, men have to
Well,
take
they
the
have to be
initiative to
raised
solve
by
their own
men.
issues. Yeah.
Well, they have
Well,
to be raised by us.
here's the thing. But here's the thing: the majority of a good chunk of men are raised by single mothers, and the majority of teachers are women. So there's not much that men can do, if you know what I'm saying. Like, there's not much. I mean, of course you can do it where you can, but I don't I don't understand. Like, the majority of a good chunk of a lot of men are raised by single mothers that are teaching them toxic ideologies and beliefs. So it's only gonna, like, I don't know what could happen. So
Okay, so now that you raised it, I would like to ask you some questions. Like, do you think that do you think that family it means installs the norms that men believe are act out later, or do you think that it is more the work of schools and teachers?
I think it's a good chunk of both. I think it can be the family, but then it could also be the I think it could also be the schools as well, because there are plenty of programs that teach, you know, certain things about like boundaries and everything else that only apply to women. And that's also harmful and toxic rhetoric as well. So what I think that we should have is we should have a more I think that we should teach our girls that that you have to follow a man's boundaries as well and respect him and love him and care for him. That's not a regressive opinion. That's treating him like a decent human being. So I think that not only women have to step up, but I think that like either toxic single mothers and on top of that, schools should change the way that they teach certain subjects. It
Yeah,
shouldn't be so
I,
gynocentric.
yeah, I was just saying that it's men do have to bring up their issues, but women have to get on board with this as well. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere. And I'd like to hand over to
So
Taz now,
just
because
writing
Taz has been waiting to speak for a long time.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks, Ma.
fine, yeah.
You know, everything we're talking about here, everything I've heard, it's about giving women who, for example, read and take to heart articles like that, giving them some motivation, you know, to see us differently than what they're reading off of these pages, you know. And to do that, you know, the unfortunate reality in my experience is that, you know, we can't do that from anything we ever got from our families or our schools or the culture at large. You know, the things I do that most often motivate women who are very civilian, they're, you know, they're not activists one way or the other. They're just regular old people. The things that I do to get their attention, right, and to get them to take this seriously, you know, as an issue that men have, is to just go ahead and prove to them, you know, that all these things that men are being encouraged to change into are ineffective, kind of repulsive, and make them uncomfortable. And then I can just look at them and say, you know, do you want more of that? Because I can do that. You know, there's nothing in these articles that I can't perform, okay, up to and including, you know, crying in therapy. But I can also demonstrate that it doesn't mean, you know, it's not the effective part of my therapy, right? And in my personal life, you know, it just makes everybody uncomfortable. But it takes that next step to be able to look at them and say, I can keep doing this, okay? And I will keep doing it until you tell me to stop, right? And give me a reason to stop. But, you know, like the guys were saying, you know, there's all of this connection to and dependent on family and the female members of the family. You know, like I said, to which I say, you know, don't give them what they expect. Give them what they're demanding. You know, until they tell you to stop and then say, okay, now we're going to try something different. Okay. And you know, now we're going to look at this from my point of view. But until they really get sick and uncomfortable and a little afraid of what we can become, they're going to keep telling us to become that. Okay? And you know, it's a matter of, you got to prove it to them. You know, words, they only penetrate so far. You know, and these women in my life that are, like I said, very civilian and kind of, unenlightened about the whole thing. If I just give them words, then they're never really convinced. But if I show them, if I say, this is what you're talking about, and then I do that, that puts a whole different spin on it. Then I can look at them and say, this is really not everything you cracked it up to be, is it? And then they have to admit that I'm right. But until there is a demonstration, then, from their perspective, all we have is words, and all we're doing is complaining. But if you show them, say, look, I can make that stuff happen. I can be entirely self-absorbed and attentive only to my own feelings and my own emotions, to the to the exclusion of everyone else's. But it doesn't make me very much fun to be around. And then I can, kind of let go of that and say, would you rather that I just be me? And the answer is always yeah. But until there is proof, they will not believe. They just don't. So, for the guys out there, show them a sample of what they're asking for, and, for the ladies, you can get involved in this too, to say, you don't know what you're asking for, because really they don't, they really don't understand the nature and the impact of their demands, but I mean, you guys can tell them, they're not going to listen to us because all we are is men, but if you say, look, that's just a recipe for disaster, and you'll end up not liking him, okay? They'll probably believe you, because they won't believe me until I show them. Now they believe.
Hey, Taz, do you think that that once men do start showing emotion and do start showing those things, do you think that they're automatically going to go into that? Because there's a theory out there that basically any time a man shows any sort of like signs of weakness or signs of like she automatically like goes to find like a different source. Do you think that that's going to happen? Do you think like that's going to cause a lot of women to like not want to be with men because of that issue? Because
I hope so.
Why?
Like I said, a demonstration has to be made. Just words is not going to do it. But yeah, what will happen is that men, who provide what is being demanded will begin being rejected. And when that happens, what kind of men are left? Okay? Because they will always be out there, right? It'll be the kind of men that, they really are complaining about. But that's all they're going to have left. Okay? And then we're not going to look so bad. We're plain, ordinary, unremarkable, just regular dudes are going to look a lot better from that point of view. But until there is that point of view, all we are is, a target for derision, because we keep putting up with it. But if we say, okay, this is what you want, this is what you get, and then the women walk away, and they will, then the kind of men they will have left are the kind of men that, that actually do generate a lot of misery in the world.
Yeah, I
See what
think
I mean?
what I
that's
find
going
a
to
bit,
ruin society
yeah.
if we do that. I think it would be better if we instead demonstrated that through fiction and showed what a bad ending it is through TV and so on.
Yeah,
I think that's gonna be very
Ma,
difficult.
that kind of makes it back into, this rescue mission to to avoid calamity, you know. And I have no problem with that. You know, I don't want calamity either.
Neither do
But
I.
if there's no understanding that a calamity is possible, then people who write articles like this are always going to have a place, and they're always going to make a good living, because they'll play on that one thing, okay, that, you know, causes people to ignore calamity. Okay. But if you show them, no, calamity is possible, you know, all of this can fall apart. You can prove, like physically actually demonstrate, you know, that everything around you that you're entirely used to and entirely feeling entitled to can be taken away, you know. And you know, I have no objection, I have no issue with being, you know, being emotionally intelligent, and I have no issue with you know, being expressive, I don't know, even feminine. Like I say, I don't have an issue with it, but it's not me, you know, it's not who I am. And if I'm not allowed to be who I am in company, then I'll be alone, you know, but I will take everything that I provide with me. See, that is the one thing that we just don't spend enough time talking about, you know, is that we say that men are valuable, and we say that men are, you know, intrinsically important, you know, and like I said, until it can be shown exactly why we're valuable and important, you know, then we are not believed, you know, we're not.
I think, yeah. So just joining on it,
I mean,
I
I
think
didn't.
that okay, fine. Darkesha wants to speak something.
Sorry, finally parked. Um, I'm just adding on to your point about guys not being allowed to be guys generally. I think it's sort of a hard situation right now, because the problem is like, and you guys were talking earlier with like classes and stuff. As an entire society, we find every way to tell guys they shouldn't like who they are, they shouldn't accept who they are, and it's really terrible what we're doing to them. I mean, I'm just gonna share a story, not my own, of a person who randomly sort of found me recently and ended up telling me a story, and it's really horrible, and it's a bit R-rated. So for anyone here who's not released to explicit content, but he's currently staying at this hostel for a bit. He's sort of in a situation where he can't really be in his house, and the lady who owns the hostel is being completely terrible. She's forcing the guys to wear these underwear that are like 2 sizes too small, because she hopes they'll suffocate their genitals enough so they won't have their normal rape desires, as she put it, which is pure absurdity. And she says it'll teach them to be more feminine, because, you know, they're starting to teach that, you know, if guys are feminine, you know, they'll be, I don't know, I guess like accepted better, and that they'll be better, and they can't be masculine. And as it is, I mean, the definitions of masculinity and feminine are so fluid and constantly changing because of different groups. It's crazy to define it, but that kind of mindset that woman has, the fact that we've gotten to that kind of point, and although we all think that's horrible, a lot of people would say that's completely fine, out there.
Yeah. And, you know, like, Ma, what you were saying about generating, you know, literature about what this kind of catastrophe would be like. I'm reminded of a book that I read a couple of years ago called The Power. It was written by a feminist author who constructed this fiction where women could disable or even kill men with a touch, with by laying their hand on them. And it was, just incredibly utopian and, fairy tale like for a grown up person's novel. It was very popular for a while. But, we would have to, come up with some kind of, other side of the coin, without like what it would be like if women could do that, and what it would really be like.
Well,
but-
they'd abuse the power just like every other person granted, like every other group granted huge powers, they'd just abuse it.
But I'm saying after that abuse, after that failure, of responsibility, what would life be like? We'd have to describe something that is obvious to all of us, but Darkeisha, what you were saying, it's not obvious to everybody. And it's also not obvious to everybody that even masculine and stoic and more traditional men, have feelings of our own. And we do. Like I said, I can provide a performance of all of the things in all of those articles. Okay. But it will be only that. It'll just be a performance. And in performing that stuff, I will be robbing everyone in my life of who I can be if I'm allowed to be myself. But that, of all the things that, I try to describe to the civilians out there, that's the hardest one to get them to believe, that I could be that way. But if I am, and if many are like me, everything will be a little bit worse for everyone. It won't just be bad for me. It'll be bad for everybody. So, like I said, it's the conversation needs to head in that direction. There has to be the understanding of the consequences of what they're demanding. And the idea that men are actually capable of providing what they're demanding, but it will cost too much. Okay?
But here's the thing: why is being the typical traditional thing such a bad thing? Like, I've never seen that as a bad thing. I guess because I grew up with it, but I never. But here's the thing: they did it. Some of my family members, they did it in a way that was respectful. Let's just say that. I think maybe some of these toxic feminists, maybe they have had traumatic experiences with men and that's why they're doing this, or maybe they just don't know maybe they just haven't been friends with the male and they just don't know how to react. I don't know why.
Like I said, they're projecting these these very problematic but very rare behaviors among adult men onto all men, okay, including me, right? And like I said, the only reasonable response to that, from them is to, like I said, give them what they want. Say, if you see me that way, then I will leave you be, and I will pick up all my toys and all my, my my charm and my intellect and all of that stuff, and I will just go away. And you won't have to deal with me anymore. What you'll have left is the kind of man that causes you all this trouble. But he'll be the only one there. I'm going to be gone.
Madison, to maybe answer your question a bit too. I don't know how real this is, but just from analysis and looking at people and observing and stuff, when it comes to extreme feminists, there are obviously those few of them that it's because of a traumatic experience. I think the majority of it though has to do just with the way things are taught today. and just in general, like all the brainwashing going on, which schools won't tell you is going on. Because we've gotten to a point where, and a lot of more radical feminists who didn't really go through trauma, they seem to have some kind of mental health issue most of the time, usually. And that mental health issue usually stemmed from being taught improperly, or, being told lies about guys, or, this whole brainwashing thing. I mean, there's a lot of therapy today, and some therapists are great, and some therapists honestly are just brainwashing. If you hear about some therapists in the jail system, they don't even try to like talk to you about issues or anything. They spend the whole time trying to make you admit that you did something even if you didn't do it. Therapists for young boys nowadays try to teach young boys, oh, but you're not a good person per se, or this thing's wrong, and it may be something that's not really wrong, and some therapists for women will start brainwashing them against boys, and so that ends up mentally affecting them because they're consistently in this cycle of like fear and anger from what's just been put in their head.
Yeah, and now they're
Well,
afraid to like give a woman a compliment whenever she's like out in the street, because they're afraid that they're going to be like criticized or ridiculed because of it. I'm like, I'm sorry, but if a guy wants to compliment you, I don't see that as a bad thing. I actually see that as a good thing. I don't care, man, woman, compliment me.
I think the discourse around masculinity has, for too long, has been on what women want. To be honest, and if there is this point about, okay, women want us to be more feminine, and now we are more feminine, but women don't want us back. So what to do? So this has been like, this is a common issue being raised by some guys in the other chat rooms I see. And to that I have to say that, you know what, there is a problem with your validation needs, to be honest. Like, you are being like you are too needy for validation, and that what needs to be addressed here, to be honest. And I think that that it has that the need for validation from women has to be analyzed in men, and has to be separated from addressing men's issues. And this is what has been this is one of the reasons why men's issues have been derailed for so long. Like, it is always centered upon, okay, this is what women want, so we wish to be more like these, we wish to exercise more of these traits to appear more attractive. But when women don't when women, those who ask for it, don't really find us that attractive, then we retaliate back in some form or another. That just is counterproductive to solving men's issues. I think that it has to come from within, not because someone else asked us to be such.
I do think that you might have a point in that we do need to form our own masculinity, and we need to be less dependent on what feminists are saying men should be like. I mean, especially because they have no idea what they want, and they keep telling us contradictory things.
Like, don't let a woman tell you how to be a man. Like, you do that yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And if women don't accept it, that's fine. If some women accept it, that's great. That's what I'm telling.
I do also think we need to go and we need to stop all this propaganda against girls. Sorry, aimed at girls, which is terrifying them about men, because they've created this whole narrative that men are evil, and that, like, I think we might have mentioned it last week. This article about this lady who got wrapped up in this um, supposedly true story called The Maid, which is on Netflix, which is basically this woman trying to make it as a maid while all the men around her are abusive and want things from her. And the Honey Badgers did a really good deconstruction on it, where they pointed out that the common factor in all of the relationships was her, and that she was probably not telling the whole story, and that she has let slip in the book multiple things which make it clear that she was probably being abusive back to the husband that she left. So it's, we've but this whole story has gotten like it's gotten a lot of women to be like into this righteous rage against men, and in which they have to, men are the evil enemy, and we've got to tell them, off, and we've got to, tell them how bad they are and how they're not doing enough for us and all that sort of stuff. And it is very propagandary. And this article was about this woman who came to the realization that MAID was, and a lot, all this man hate in the media is just toxic, and is, she's actually very privileged. And I do think that this should lead to an opening of the discussion of when men shouldn't be responsible for things in general, and when women should step up as well. I think that should really be, the question that we leave with this. If Dark Asia could, if anyone wants to comment on that, fine. But once a couple of comments have come in, could Dark Asia take us out, please?
All I gotta say is, with great power comes great responsibility. That is my. So if females are going to basically tell men with like how to be men, maybe they should take some responsibility for that, for how they do that. Take some responsibility for their own actions and what they are doing.
They should take responsibility for how they analyze things. I mean, there obviously are some things feminists and like the women's movement aren't doing the greatest at, but I think there are some things that they're fighting for that are sort of a double-edged sword where they affect both women and men, but they're not fighting it correctly. They're fighting it in a way that's sort of man-hating because they haven't analyzed the situation correctly.
I think some of that we can put on the shoulders of a lot of men, though, because, like the article of the woman saying, there's too much man hate out there, that, it takes men to say, this is a consequence of what you have allowed to happen. It was inevitable, and you can't blame us men for it because we're not doing it. Okay? But if men don't do that, if that's just a kind of honesty, to be able to say, sorry, but you did it to yourself. Okay. Now, Darkisha and Madzilla, you guys, these things are obvious to you, and I hear that it bothers you that it's not obvious to them, but the hard reality is it is not obvious to them. They have been lied to. They've been made blind, because nobody told them. And some of that is us guys' fault, so I make it my business, to say this happened, it's bad, and it's not our fault. You can do something about it, but will you? Being Madzilli, we're talking about being responsible, and men have always known that we don't have to be responsible, but we have an understanding of what will happen if we don't. If we're not responsible, stuff falls apart, and to have that, have that idea in the back of your head, it's not that hard to be responsible, because you have a reason to be. But if somebody doesn't have a reason to be responsible, chances are good they won't be, the way it is.
So thank you everyone for coming to this week's Friday live stream chat on the Men's Human Rights server, the semi-official server of the Men's Rights subreddit. We are here every Friday now at about 4 p.m. UK time, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern. And if you have any recommendations for topics, please feel free to send them to Men Are Human, to Blue Orange, to myself. And thank you all for coming. Have a good day.